This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Love Fruit podcast. Today, our guest is John Coleman. And John Coleman is originally from England. He now lives in Thailand. He's been 30 years plus on a vegan diet. He's been into the raw foods and fruit-based diet about 30 years. 20 years of that time. He is the uh, author of a book called We Are Omnivores and has a website and a ongoing project called We Are Herbivores. You can find out more about that at weareherbivores.com with the intention of putting together a documentary about that information. His information, his books, if you've read The 80-10-10 Diet by Doug Graham, he's actually mentioned or referenced in that. And John also had an audio program that you can listen to as well. So, John, that's a little quick summary of you from what I know about you, but would you like to share a little bit about yourself as an introduction?
Sure, yeah, I'll give you a potted history of me. I'm a child of the late 60s, basically. I noticed when I was growing up, my mum was quite big time into meat eating, into dairy. I actually didn't enjoy meat particularly. She liked to prepare meats, not so much in the highly processed way that, like everything's hidden, like pork chops and things were, and liver, just chucked on the plate was pretty standard. I found the smell, the taste, and the texture of meat pretty unpleasant, to be honest. I didn't like the smell of the cooking and all of that. So it kind of, I guess that set me out on the path of being a bit more inquiring about things. Then one day I went to university and I bumped into a vegan there. He didn't say he was a vegan or anything. He wasn't your stereotype vegan that tells you he's vegan at the first meeting. Yeah. So that's a bit of a myth, I think. This guy was very, very quiet about it. He was kind of, a sort of a side bow kind of vegan, not in your face, subtle. And he said, "Why are you getting your lunch at McDonald's? There's a veggies stall next door. They sell burgers. They're cheaper. Oh, and by the way, they're meat free." So I thought, oh, okay, I'm not a huge fan of meat. I'll take a look into this. So I found the veggies trailer, and they were indeed selling completely vegan burgers and hot dogs, although of course they were called not dogs. And I actually really enjoyed them. I was like, hey, actually this plant food seems to be a lot more pleasant than the Big Mac. And I know that's not saying much because, Big Macs are pretty hideous at the end of the day, even if you like meat. But anyway, that's the start of the vegan journey. And later on, I found a book called Why You Don't Need Meat, and that was by Peter Cox. I found it at one of these sort of so-called health food stores. I saw it outside. I picked it up, had a read of that, and okay, there's more to it. There's more to it than just, oh, actually, this tastes good, that tastes good. There's a health impact involved as well. And of course, the other thing I'd seen at the veggies burger stall was a big, almost life-size picture of a dead cow hung and gutted. And that really connected the ethical side of it. And I thought, actually, I don't really want to have blood on my hands at every meal. So I had the thing together by then, ethically and health-wise. I thought, yeah, actually, I'm going to do the vegan thing. So, I mean, that went on for a few years. And then I guess sometime around 1992 to 94, something like that, I found a group on the internet. And, back in the day now, we're before Twitter and Facebook and all of that stuff. You had these email lists. So you sent your email address to this list server, and the list server would take your email address, and then anyone who sent a message to that list server's email box, everybody got a copy. So it was like a bit like a chat room, but not in real time. You had to wait for the mail to come. And on there, I bumped into this chap called Laurie 40, also known as Lawrence J. 40, or aka LOFO. And he was a chemical engineer and a sort of hippie guy, I guess. I don't know whether they'd like me to call him that, but that's how most people would probably see him. But he dropped out of the corporate world and was helping people to recover their health. So he ran, for a while, he ran this raw food recovery place in Boston. Now, this is back in the 70s, by the way, when I was a child. So he would take obese people and he would just fill his refrigerator up with fruit and vegetables, and he'd say, look, stay with me a few weeks, eat as much fruit and veg as you like. And of course people would do this, and their weight would plummet, and they'd start to feel really healthy. So, and that's where I learned a bit more about the raw food kind of thing. And one of the things he enlightened me about was the Ann Wigmore Institute there. I forget exactly what it's called, but he said he was involved in that as well. He went along, he saw everybody there was gaunt and weak. And of course, they're just trying to eat vegetables and vegetable matter. And that got Laurie thinking about, there's something wrong here. You know, if this is the right diet, they should be thriving. So this led to the idea, well, actually, of course, we're primates and we're like chimpanzees, and chimpanzees eat a lot of fruit, and fruit is a source of calories, and that's the missing ingredient from this Ann Wigmore diet. So that's how Laurie came to the thing, well, basically we're frugivores, like chimpanzees. So I picked up on this idea, and I had a health crisis probably around 1995. I think I had shingles. Let's say my lifestyle wasn't the most respective of my health at the time, even though I was vegan. And that led me to think a bit about, actually, I need to make some changes here. I had the info from LOFO. So I started reading and studying about natural hygiene at this time, and I read a lot of Shelton's work. And I started to incorporate a lot of raw food in my diet. I stopped eating refined and processed foods almost overnight. So I'm just eating like steamed vegetables, no salt. So that went on, I think, for a year or two. And my health improved massively on this what you might call hygienic diet.
Sure.
Then I bumped into another book called Nature's First Law, which is probably kind of notorious in raw food circles. I don't know whether it still is, but it was in the day. It's basically was plagiarized work of Hovhanessian. So I read Hovhanessian's book. But anyway, upon reading Nature's First Law, and I met all the guys involved as well, the three Nature's First Law guys. I think I met, or at least I met two of them in London. And they came over and did a few talks and things. I think probably back in the 90s, we're going back to again. But anyway, that inspired me to go completely raw. So I transitioned and went completely raw very quickly. At some point, again, in just after the mid-90s, late 90s. And I pretty much stuck to the raw food diet for about 6 years. So I'm talking about more than 90% of my food was raw. I think at one point for around 2 years, I was almost completely fruitarian, a little bit of salad. And yeah, I think my weakness was olives. So I'd sometimes buy pickled olives or something like that. I did actually want to have some amount of something salty in the diet. And, you know, I don't know whether that was addiction. I don't think it was. I think perhaps there is genuinely a need for saltiness, or a minimum amount of salt, or it's possible to be deficient eating vegetation. I haven't really got to the bottom of that one, but it's very common for herbivores to be attracted to salt licks. So, you know, hygiene says no salt, but maybe there's a bit more to the story than that. I haven't got to the bottom of it. But anyway, that seemed to suit me. But I noticed after a few years, my legs started to, I used to get pains in my legs. So I did a heel scan and found out that I had osteopenia, which is low bone density. So the fruit diet wasn't working well for me. There wasn't enough of the bulk minerals. So I started taking supplements, and I started to expand my diet a bit more and focus on making sure I got all the nutrients I needed. And that's pretty much where I am today, although I'm not so strict on the all raw. I mean, I still did a few years all raw, but it tends to be who I'm in relationship with and where I'm living and so on and so forth. But as you might gather, Thailand's a great place for being a raw foodist. And the vegetable matter here is amazing. I've learned about so many new vegetables and herbs that are consumed raw in Thailand traditionally as well. So there's a lot. I've come a bit further away from the idea that we're just frugivores and fruit eaters.
That's really great,
So,
John. Thank you for all that.
yeah, that's the bit of history.
Yeah, and one of the names that came up there, we'll go into a bit of that more, but Laurie Forty, I've seen the name around on a few websites, but didn't really know that much about him. So that's really, is he someone you're still in touch with? Is he still around, or?
I believe he's deceased. He must be in his 70s or 80s by now. My relationship with him broke down early 2000s, something like that. I thought he was a bit too dogmatic because I started studying evolutionary theory, and things got a bit complicated from that point on in the relationship because he rejected evolutionary theory, and I kind of saw it as you have to, well, you can't really understand biology without evolutionary theory. But yeah, that we got into a bit of a tussle around that, which was a bit silly really, but it was annoying at the time. But he was very influential for me. His background was scientific. He was a chemical engineer. So he introduced me to the idea that, well, of course, nutrition is quantitative. So you have to get enough of, the different kinds of nutrients to nourish your body. I mean, it's obvious, but a lot of people don't think very quantitatively about nutrition. And Hovhanessian was one of these. He sort of said, well, all raw foods have everything you need in them. And maybe that's true to some extent, but actually the amounts really do matter. So you have to have enough minerals, at the end of the day to support your mineral requirements. And you can't just count on mangoes or apples to do it for you. And I actually saw quite a few people fail on raw diets at the time and get into chronic malnutrition and end up in hospital on the raw food scene. I think because they were influenced by Hovhanessian and like every food's got everything you need in it, and it's too naive.
Okay. So when you first initially went vegan earlier on in your life and when you changed, did you notice improvements to your health and to your life at that point?
Absolutely. My health did improve when I transitioned onto the vegan diet. I think I would say I would get less colds. That was the one thing I noticed. But I was never one for much for colds, but I would always get a lot of catarrh or, phlegm when I got colds, loads of it, copious amounts of snot and phlegm. It was hideous. But when I went vegan, the colds got much milder and less frequent. So, and the other big thing I noticed was body odors. So fecal odor, the odor of flatus or gas, all went down very substantially. There's actually been some interesting work done on that in a study, which I cite on my website.
And was there further improvements going raw or any changes you noticed there?
Yeah, so the vegan thing, I would say on a scale to 10 was like 1 or 2 in terms of the health improvement. And when I went to the high raw, sort of what you might call frugivore diet, the health change was absolutely night and day. So within a few weeks, I had lost quite a bit more weight, but my energy level had just skyrocketed. I think I dropped an hour's sleep, something like that. I could sleep a lot less. And my bedtimes were very consistent. Like I would be tired at 10:30 and I would wake up when the birds start making a noise. And it was almost like a switch, the waking up. It was like I would just wake up, I would feel fully refreshed and straight away ready to do stuff. It was really almost shocking. And I was like, oh, maybe my body's kind of been poisoned, or it's been asleep all of my life.
Wow.
And then I start doing this thing in I guess I was in my 20s or possibly early 30s at the time. I figure that out. Yeah, maybe late 20s. So it's like night and day. So I purchased a mountain bike. I started doing cross-country running. I mean, I just had so much energy, I couldn't sit down.
Wow.
I just wanted to do stuff. I thought, I want to do something. I want to move. I also got into the dance music scene because I like moving my body. So everything just became about movement. I cycled to work. I think it was a 2-hour cycle to and fro from work at the time. So I would cycle to and fro work 3 times a week. So I'm, putting on quite a few miles cycling, and it was all up and downhill as well, the cycling trip. So I got a mountain bike and started doing a lot of mountain biking at the weekend as well. I loved cross country. The cross country was quite interesting because I'd run for a few kilometers like a regular pace, and then I'd get a jolt of energy and I would just sprint for a few hundred meters, and then I'd bring it down. So I would do something like that. So I was very fit as well. I took part in a few medical studies at that time too, a couple of them. One of them, they did sort of MRIs on my body. They wanted to know about body fat composition, and they were comparing vegans, I think, and vegetarians and omnivores to see about body fat. And it was very interesting. And I think I was weighing about 65.5 kilos at the time, so I was very lean. And the doctor said, "Oh, you're like really healthy." It was positive feedback.
Great. So we talked about, you talked a little bit about the books you read that kind of got you changing your diet and got you more into the raw foods and stuff. You mentioned Hovhanessian and Shelton and stuff. Could you give a bit of a summary of some of the things you read and maybe what you got out of them, or maybe even what you saw as mistakes about them looking back?
Right. So Shelton and Natural Hygiene, I think, considering the time they were written, are almost perfectly spot on in the thinking. Possibly, I would say some of the defects are similar to Hovhanessian's in the idea that sort of nature is perfect, or is some kind of perfect state. I don't know whether you really have that in hygiene, but some hygienists will say don't take supplements. I will take vitamin B12, for example. I do take some others because you see, the food we're eating is not natural. It's been bred, it's been grown under artificial conditions. It's not out in the wild. And even if it were out in the wild, soil conditions can vary from one place to another, and plants can actually thrive in quite minerally sparse conditions and produce rather minerally poor vegetation that is not sufficient really for our optimal health. So I think that, and an understanding of evolutionary biology was some of the missing ingredients of Shelton's works. And there's a few little things here and there, like I say, about supplements and B12 and stuff like that. But I think those are just tweaks. They're very important tweaks, but overall the thinking, I think, was pretty much spot on. Hovhanessian is very similar. The thinking is pretty good, but the details are important, and I think maybe those details were missing at the time. I mean, it's like TC Fry, the guy, I think, was a boxer basically, if I'm not mistaken. So a lot of these people didn't have a scientific background,
Right.
and it's the same with who's the other guy, the mucus guy?
Arnold Ehret?
Glory Red. Yeah, Ehret is another. He may have been the boxer, actually. I could be getting them mixed up. Yeah, Ehret was the boxer, I think. I'm getting a bit mixed up here, but similar to him, these people came, and like me, they experimented, and then they came up with their own ideas and theories to explain. And they weren't necessarily scientifically robust. And I thought, well, okay, I can read some science books. So I started reading a whole bunch of science books in order to kickstart this project, to take this idea of, are we omnivores, a bit further. And I thought that it was necessary to bring that discipline to the raw food movement as well. So I started producing tapes and things to make it rigorous.
Sure, and something you mentioned as well, the Nature's First Law, the book from David Wolf, I think David Wolf, Stephen Arlen, and R.C. Deeney, the three guys. And as you were saying, infamously kind of plagiarized the Hovhanessian book, but they were obviously a big part of raw foods, promoting the raw foods idea, I suppose, going back to the 90s. And you mentioned talks and stuff, and all this time, were you in the UK? And was there a raw food scene? Was there a vegan scene? What was going on? Were there events happening? Could you meet other people who were interested in the same ideas?
Sure, yeah, there was quite a thriving community at the time. I used to go to a fairly regular raw food meetup in London. I can't remember exactly where it was. It's run by a chap called Grant. And there would be a few people who come along there, and people prepare and share food. Yeah, the Nature's First Law came over and did some talks, which really, I think, helped to popularize the idea a bit more in the UK. I think at that time, Shazzy, you may have heard of her.
Sure.
She kicked off. She had her own kind of angle on raw food. So she used to run some meetings and things as well, and events. I'd go to those. And there was another lady as well. I'm trying to remember. Her name was Karen Nola, I believe. I'm still in touch with her, or still, I think, see her on Facebook. She started like a whole coaching thing. So they were the two other personalities I knew about who were kind of big in the UK at the time. I ran a few talks and made I think maybe a couple of tapes. It's back in I think at the time it was recorded tapes, or maybe even CDs that I made at the time as well. So sometimes I'd hold my own events, or I'd turn up at other people's events and do a talk about something or other related to nutrition.
Excellent. So did you ever meet Anne Osborne back then in the UK, or Tony Wright? Was he around?
Yes, I met Tony Wright at an event in Cornwall, I believe, probably when my middle son was about 1 year old. So I think we're talking about 2006, something like that. Yeah, there was a raw food festival in Cornwall. I bumped into him there and heard his story. I don't really attach any scientific credibility to it. And don't believe it personally. Anne Osborne, yeah, I'm pretty sure I met her at some events as well, but maybe only your events. I can't remember before.
Yeah. So just since we mentioned Tony Wright, so he has the idea about left in the dark, so the left hand side of the brain, or the right, I can't remember which side, but one part is kind of in control, and he sees that as being almost a damaged side of the brain because of moving away from the right diet and environment, and that we have this kind of inner genius that is being sort of repressed. And yeah, I've really enjoyed his ideas at times, and then it comes across a little bit sort of I don't think it's a great explanation for why the world's going like his talk often started off with, look how crazy the world is, isn't it obvious we're all crazy? Like that was sort of like, we're all crazy, aren't we? And I thought, it's not really, like there are reasons for things happening. Like it's not all just violent aggression.
Yeah, I think these kind of ideas are again similar to the ones you see in natural hygiene or in Hovhanessian. There's an element of the paradisical in them, like things are actually supposed to be, it's supposed to be nice, basically.
Yeah.
And of course, there's no notion of this in biological science. We're adapted to survive in certain conditions, and game theory will explain why some people do this and some people do that.
It's really,
you know,
it's interesting. There is a very strong appeal of people that get into of human beings in general. Is this either you call it appeal to nature as part of it, or like that's one thing, but also this kind of, like you're saying, like this appeal to like a paradise, a state of, and a lot of the religious texts, obviously famously the Garden of Eden talks like there was a time when everything was perfect and everything was, and we lived in harmony, and
pristine nature.
and I think the Greeks had stories about that. I think the Hindu stories have things about, so we have a real appeal in us to that. It's a real. Do you have any idea why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's an oddity, isn't it? I think it's worth mentioning. I think the Gnostic Christians as well, they had kind of the other view that the physical world was a wretched and defiled place. And we're here to, like, almost as it's a spiritual test. We're given all this horror. We're given all these horrors of the material world, and how we respond to them. If we do the good godly stuff, then we get to the perfected realm after we're deceased, of course.
Sure.
If we don't, if we're being good children.
Yeah.
So yeah, it crops up all over the place, and in Buddhism as well, is more like, well, actually, yeah, our experience is we're born in this mud, and then if we do the enlightened thing, then we rise up and we become a sort of more like a super being. So yeah, it's all over the place, this idea, but I guess none of us particularly. For me, the bottom line is sort of none of us really like particularly grappling with nature. It looks nice, but when you get into the details, it's pretty hideous. And it's scary.
It's funny, like when a lot of times when people get into fruitarianism, raw foods, they really start to, especially, well, men and women, but I've seen it with a lot of young guys, like they want to almost try and embrace this going back to nature thing. They want to live in a tree or something, grow their beard long, all these things. And
absolutely,
it can be dangerous. Like some people have put themselves in real danger, and I find it almost ironic that I would imagine that like a bunch of the primates that are like us live in near the Congo or around the Congo kind of area of Africa, I believe, like bonobos, chimpanzees. And yet I think the Congo is like a really inhospitable place. Like ironically for us, like it's a really difficult country to live in, and like the various parasites and stuff there is really difficult to deal with, I've heard. Yeah.
Well, Lawrence Forty actually moved to Hawaii, I think it was the Big Island, to start off an intentional raw food commune. So he set up there and got some other people over. Most of the other people he got over, a lot of them were really dysfunctional people. They had personality disorders. And eventually he contracted a couple of tropical diseases. I think it was leptospirosis and rat lung disease.
Wow.
And exactly for the reasons you suggest, there are parasites all over the place. And, stuff is pooping on your food. If you don't wash it or cook it, you get the parasites. And it was to the point, he got to the point where he couldn't get out of bed, and he was, I think, doubly incontinent. And by this time, he couldn't get money out of the bank. He was actually stuck on the island, pretty much in bed, and couldn't do a whole lot of anything. And he was obviously reliant on other people to support him. Eventually, he figured out a way, I think, to get the money and get back to the USA. But cooking and washing things, it isn't 100% stupid. Yeah. It can work out for the better compared to what nature might have to offer us.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, if you're not partly if you're not born into that. I mean, the same argument with like when white people or Europeans went over to other places and brought their diseases and wiped out huge populations of people
Yes.
passing on diseases. Like they were they were used to it or they were born into it, but other people weren't, and so they didn't have the immunity, I suppose. But um, I just think that I've never heard that story, but that's really interesting to me. And the amount of times I've heard of things of people going somewhere to start intentional communities, and there was there was there's ones in Africa that I've heard about, at least one where, but I've heard a number of bad stories about these things. And the thing you said is absolutely right. You've got to ask yourself who are the people that you're going to attract, especially if it's like, hey, come for free and work on this land and let's all eat fruit together. It's like
Hmm.
you are going to attract some people who are kind of running away from society and struggling to fit in, and there might be reasons for that. And yeah, and I've seen people, as you're saying with the parasites thing, um, and but they might contract something like that and refuse to go to hospital because of
Yeah.
this, like anti-medical thing that a lot of
Oh,
people
yeah.
call it.
I can tell you another story. When I was staying in Gopanan, there's a lot of communities there, intentional community type activity there. I bumped into a guy called Colin. Actually, it became a dear friend. We did quite a few things together. Lovely, lovely guy, vegan for a long time. Also ran a healing retreat in the USA, very successfully. He moved to Gopanan for sort of his retirement, I guess. He was set up there. He did some talks and things that I went to. And I'm not sure exactly what was wrong with him. I don't know whether it was prostate cancer or something like that, but there was something wrong with his urinary tract system, whatever. He wouldn't go to the doctors or have medical intervention at all. And he'd obviously had this problem for a while, and of course, eventually it killed him. And it was, really sad and shocking.
Wow.
Sad to lose a friend
Yeah.
that I've become very close to. And I don't know. I don't know. Should he have got some antibiotics and a surgery or something? I think possibly he would have been better off. But also you don't want to be naive about the medical system and the financial, particularly in Thailand, the financial conflict that's there, and the absence of knowledge of how to be healthy as well. I mean, there are things to take into consideration. But I think the body can get to the point where it's beyond its natural capability to fix itself. And then I think surgery and drugs might offer a survival opportunity that you don't want to overlook.
Sure. Sure.
But again, you don't want to be naive about it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, going back to so you at what point did you leave the UK, and what made you do that?
Right. Yeah, so it's a transitional process. So I was living with a woman called Sophie at the time, with whom I have my youngest child. And there's a whole horrible story that goes along with this relationship, which I don't really want to include in this presentation. But
For sure.
we
Yeah.
could go into it. Yeah, we could go into it, but I think it's very tangential. But anyway, we started exploring coming and staying in Thailand. So I'd stopped working full time so I could help raise our son. So we'd come to Thailand on and off. And we did this a couple of times. So we would stay 6 months in the UK, 6 months in Thailand. And I think there were two big frustrations driving it. The main ones were the difficulty finding properties to live in the UK, the price of property, the effort you had to go through to rent somewhere to stay. So the property market to grapple with. So we started living in a converted truck, a living vehicle, as they say. That got rid of that problem pretty much. It gave us a whole bunch of other problems on top, though. And the other one, of course, is the weather. We didn't really like the winter. It was unpleasant, particularly when we started with the live-in vehicle. So we've come to Thailand and stayed for 6 months. We bumped into, I think the first time we came over was just for a few weeks. And we stayed at the Raw Food Winter with a guy called Connor. He organized it. So that was like a completely raw food event that was run in Chiang Mai. So that was our first visit. We met a lot of other raw food folks there and other people dabbling with the lifestyle. I think I did some talks.
I was there as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes.
That's where I met you, I think, pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I think that was the first time. I think there was a second one. I'm not sure if we came to that one.
I went twice, but maybe I only saw you one time there. Yeah.
Yeah. The first one I think was pretty golden in terms of meeting people. The second time was, I think, more people, but it was a bit more fractured. But yeah, it was good days. Yeah, so we started doing that. Then I broke up with Sophie. There's a whole story about that, which you can probably find on the internet if you want to. But it ended tragically with her dead. Nothing exactly to do with me. It was her new boyfriend. Anyway, won't go into that too much.
Yeah.
So that tragedy happened. But just before that, I had managed to find permanent work in Thailand because I'd been back over and staying I was still left in the UK after I broke up with Sophie. And so I came over to Thailand in 2017. And I've pretty much been living here solidly since then. I've settled down with a Thai lady, so I have a Thai girlfriend now. She's an excellent sort of stepmother figure for my youngest son as well. So that's where we're at, and yeah, we're vegan still, of course. And Shay's been raised vegan, and most of his first years of life he was 100% raw as well, or pretty much very high raw. I think he really liked broccoli and oranges when he was a baby. So when he started eating, we did used to blanch the broccoli though, so I don't know whether that counts as not really 100% raw, but it's a little bit tough for a baby. So that was his sort of first food experience. He loved broccoli when he was a baby, but difficult to get him to eat it now.
Sure. Excellent. I mean, you also have a connection with Doug Graham. I know that you've known him for a long time, and I think prior to the 8 to 10 book coming out, and you are referenced in that and so on. What's your relationship with Doug? Where does that go back to? When did you meet him?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the first time I actually met Rosie before Doug. So this goes back, I think, to the 90s. Mm-hmm. She was doing raw food events and activities at the time as well. I don't think, she was pretty popular. Maybe not in the limelight as much as Shazzy and Karen, but she was involved. So I met up with her sometime to talk about food and nutrition because I thought she was very interesting, and she kind of got me, I think, a bit more deeply involved in the natural hygiene stuff. Dougie, I guess I bumped into soon afterwards. I think he started going out with Rosie sometime after I met her, and I'm not sure. I guess they were married not too long after them. And we went to one of Doug's events. So when I say we, I mean myself and Sophie, because I was with her at the time. So we went to one of those events. That was in 2008, I believe. I may have seen Doug talking somewhere before then. I can't recall. But it was the sort of 2007, 2008 era. So I went to one of Doug's events. I think I was already familiar with Doug though before then. That's where also, of course, I started to hear a bit more about natural hygiene at that time. Sophie and I got good friends with Doug and Rosie. We'd go to their house sometimes. They were living in Stoynton, I think, at the time. Then they moved somewhere else. So it was nice to go and visit because it's a very beautiful area of England. And yeah, if you get a spare day out or something and you want to go to the countryside, beautiful areas to go around Pulborough and Stoynton, walking, cycling, and so forth. I actually lived with Sophie there for a few years, not far from Doug and Lozzie. We were fully raw, I think, or pretty much, fully raw most of the time there. So yeah, we would go around. We weren't exactly neighbours; they were in the next village, but we could cycle over and pay a visit, no problem.
Excellent, excellent. And
Yeah.
what do you think about his books and his information?
Yeah, the 80-10-10 makes a lot of sense. I read his book when it came out. Again, I'd probably add something around supplements to the advice, or what you might call the lifestyle. But that was pretty much the lifestyle I was living at the time, and what I'd arrived at through understanding what Laurie had to say. I think the thing that Doug brought that was a bit more, it was important, was a bit more consciousness of eating greens and adequate vegetation, because some people try and be fruitarian, and I did that, and you can get it a bit short on minerals. And I think Doug really emphasizes the vegetation side of things, and that's very important. So I would say if you were to look at any of the raw food literature and lifestyle sort of guidance around it, I would say look at the 80-10-10. It's about the best you can get.
So let's talk a little bit about the situation you're talking about with the osteopenia, and
yeah,
what exactly happened there. What were you eating at the time? What was the symptoms, and how did you find out, and all that stuff? And then how did you treat that, so to speak?
Yeah. So I was eating an almost exclusively fruit diet at the time. I would eat some salad, but if you look at the 80-10-10, it's actually quite demanding. I can't remember whether it's 1 or 2 pounds of greens, but you're supposed to eat a lot of greens on that diet. And when we went round to Dougie's house, you'd have a salad bowl and it would be colossal. And it would usually have loads of spinach in it, lettuce, and so on and so forth. The dark green leafy vegetable matter. And that's really important. I wasn't doing that. I was eating a lot of apples, a lot of mangoes, grapes, bananas, and berries as well. So that was the mainstay of my diet, was fruit. As I say, I did have this thing for pickled olives and the wanting something a bit salty.
Sure.
But other than that, I was pretty much, I would say, like 99% by volume or weight of the food that I was eating was fruit. And I stayed well doing that for, I guess, a couple of years or nearly 2 years. But my weight started to go down until I hit sort of 65.5, like I say, and I stopped at that. But I noticed I began to get these pains, like aches in my legs, and they really start to become quite painful. So I checked this out. I Googled it to try and find out, self-diagnose, well, what might be the problem here? And they suggested low bone density. Mineral deficiency was what I came up with as the sort of the diagnosis, if you like. So I took myself to one of those mobile medical test centres. They drive them around on vans, and they'll offer you a whole slew of different medical tests. Usually, I think about 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 tests. So, they'll do your cholesterol and all of that, blood pressure and blah, blah, blah. And I got my heel something or other done. But basically, they put a sound energy through the bone in your heel bone, and using the readings from that, they can tell what your bone density is. and I had a bone density. It wasn't at osteoporosis, it was the level before that. So my body obviously wasn't getting enough minerals, and they gave me a bunch of dietary advice. So I started, I didn't take calcium supplements exactly. I started using fortified orange juice. So at the time you could go into, I think, Sainsbury's, and you could get this orange juice, and it was fortified with calcium. It had a bit of extra calcium added to it, and it was a very highly absorbable form of calcium. I actually drank too much of that stuff, and it started making my muscles tense, because my body had got so used to being in calcium depletion. The sudden flush of calcium-rich diet sort of blew my muscles away. My body wasn't used to having so much calcium, and it was affecting the electrolyte balance in my leg muscles. So they got very stiff. So I had to take it a bit more gradually. But anyway, my bone density fully recovered. I don't think it took too long. I went back to the same mobile place and did the scan thing again, and I recovered.
It was like a mobile testing place.
Yeah. So sometimes you'll outside the supermarkets, they would stop, and of course people will bump into when they go along. And usually what they're looking for is to spot people with high blood pressure, because everyone's dying of heart disease or whatever.
Yeah.
And they're trying to help people to pick that up and change their diet basically or get on medication to deal with these sort of common ailments that people have on the standard Western diet.
And did they mention vitamin D? Was that something you had to supplement as well or check as a result of that?
I can't remember. Yeah, I think they did mention that as well. I was taking no supplements during this period, so I was being the good hygienist. I wasn't taking B12, I wasn't taking vitamin D, none of that. So I changed, and yes, I did start using vitamin D as well, and I still take vitamin D to this day too.
Oh wow, even in Thailand.
Sorry. Well, the ironic thing in Thailand, so the ironic thing in Thailand is that a lot of people can be vitamin D deficient here for two reasons. One, Thais have darker skin, as you might expect, so they don't absorb the sun so well, which of course is kind of part of the point of having darker skin. But also because it's so hot and you tend to get burned when you go outside if you're not very careful. Most people don't spend long outdoors. I had a similar problem when I went to New Zealand. You could literally only stay out in the sun for about 5 minutes and your skin would burn. So most people are very careful about the sun. Of course, there's this whole thing of avoiding skin cancer and the fear that the sun's going to give you cancer. Okay, if you do it a lot and too much, it's bad for you. So there is a right amount of sun to get. But whether you're getting it and achieving the optimal amount is kind of a formula that's probably a bit too annoying to work out. So it's easier, as far as I'm concerned, just to have the insurance and take some vitamin D.
Mm-hmm.
And this is particularly important with COVID going around, because apparently vitamin D is strongly protective for infectious diseases as well. So I've had COVID once, and that ironically was when our vitamin D supplement had run out and we couldn't get it. Mm-hmm. Now we're back on it. We've not had any problems. Purely anecdotal evidence, but it seems to be important for that as well.
So you wrote a book, obviously, and you said you did some tapes, audio programs. The book, I think, is We Are Omnivores. I think people can still get it online. And when did you write that?
It's called, right, so it's called Humans Omnivores. I think I wrote the second edition or published the second edition in 2008. I think there was a first edition a year or two before that. So the idea was, and this came from Laurie Forte, he was critical of the idea we're omnivores, and he wanted to sort of make it scientific. So he compared us to chimpanzees. As it turns out, this isn't actually correct. Chimpanzees are actually omnivorous, and I explained that. I think I explained it in the book and the video. So they're actually not a good comparison, and I discovered this after reading some scientific literature which explains in detail why chimpanzees are omnivores, and it's not just a dietary habit kind of thing. They physically have the teeth for consuming meat. So they're rather more like dogs. They are actually adapted to meat eating. This was a bit of a surprise. Laurie hadn't been, I think, particularly, maybe he just hadn't looked at this literature, but he hadn't been very studious. And I decided to be very studious about this, and I read a whole lot of books, scores of papers I got from the library, scientific papers. So I really went to the primary literature to research, to write this book and make it scientifically credible. And I continue this research to this day. I'm always discovering new bits and pieces. And when I had enough research, I thought, okay, I'm going to make the research video. And that also, I think I call that Are Humans Omnivores? But it's part of a bigger project, which I've published. It's called www.weareherbivores.com, which is the website. And the idea there is to actually make a more publicly accessible program about this whole topic, exploring are we omnivores?
Sure. And
so I really wanted to take the scientific credibility and build it up and up and up.
So talking about chimpanzees for a moment, my understanding is that chimpanzees do eat meat and primates do eat meat. But it's a relatively small part of their diet, is it not?
Yes. So if you look at my video, you'll find there's like a triangle there. So most primates will specialize in 2, but not 3 of the kinds of food that primates eat. So they'll either eat mostly fruit and vegetation, and then maybe a little bit of animal matter, so the odd insect or 2, something like this, or they'll eat mostly fruit and animal matter and only a little bit of vegetation, or they'll fit in the last category, which is mostly vegetation and animal matter, but not a whole lot of fruit. So they'll all tend to fall in one of the 3 corners. And there's really no primates that fall bang in the middle, the circle bit which I draw, which is truly omnivorous. They'll eat any amount, or they'll eat a lot of everything. There aren't really any omnivores in that kind of they'll eat anything. It's usually 2 main things plus a little bit of a third. That's how that's the diet of primates. The other great apes are basically derived species. So our ancestors are more primitive. We go back a longer way in our evolutionary history from where we are today than the other great apes. The other great apes went through a whole lot of more evolution after us, and during that evolution they became more omnivorous. Okay. And you can see that in the dentition of all of the other great apes, with the exception of the gorilla, which became more herbivorous.
All right. I also thought that chimps, a lot of their eating is dependent on their environment, and maybe that's the case with primates as well. As like, if there's scarce fruit, then they will eat more of other things. If they're and like, I don't know, what is it quite environment based, depending on where they're at, where the forest is? And
it is, yeah. So all of the great apes prefer to eat fruit primarily, whether it's gorilla, chimpanzee, bonobo, or orangutan. They all like fruit, and they will prefer that. But they also will eat vegetation, and they will also eat animal matter when they can get it. But you're right, they don't eat a lot of animal matter typically. But it's obviously been important enough to their diet for them to get the teeth and jaws for it. And likewise for the gorilla, vegetation's obviously been an important part of the gorilla's evolutionary history because it's adapted to vegetation.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is environmentally driven.
Yeah.
Animals have to make the best of the particular eco niche that they find themselves in. They have to try and survive with what's most available in their geographic location.
So
And that will have a selective pressure on the gene pool.
So I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking that fruit is the preference, but can't always get it, can't always get access to it, and so on. But I'm also wondering if that means that the the primates are kind of competing for who can guard the fruit or who can guard the territory or who can get access to the fruit
Oh
areas.
yeah, they're very territorial. Yeah, yeah. So basically, primates they will want to compete for two things: food and the best food and the best mates.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're right. They're very territorial. So well, they've got different strategies, but chimpanzees, our closest relatives, are very territorial. So they're defending their mating opportunities and their feeding opportunities, basically, because that's survival for them.
Yeah, and so where do humans fit in? Because obviously human beings are, I mean, I know we're similar, but we're also different, and we don't have hair typically, or a lot of hair on the outside of our body. We walk upright most of the time. We're not so dependent on living in trees. We use tools and so on. We have our language is more developed. There's a lot of differences, of course, with humans. And where does that fit in? Because one of my questions was, did we become, did we get more, did we evolve in that way because of more access to fruit? Were we able to specialize in that? Were we able to maximize our territory? Because humans are the best at, I would say, at cultivating or managing our territory of all the animals, I guess. Um, but how do we fit in, or what do you see as where humans were originally, and what would our ancestors have been doing, and when did that all change?
Right. So for most, or I forget the timeline exactly, but I think about 36 million years ago, the Earth went through a big change. I could be wrong. It could be 3 million. I'm not sure on the timeline. Apologize for that one. But up until that point, you didn't have a season, so things were like summery all year. So that you would have had, and you kind of still do have this to some extent in Thailand. You can get fruit. You can get fruit throughout the year.
Yep.
Now, eventually, like I say, I think it may be 3.6 million years ago, this stops and we start to develop this idea of seasons and climates changing seasonally. And then that creates a problem for fruiting trees. And now you start to get a shortage of highly energy nutritious food available all year round. Now, there's two things you can do when that happens and the fruit's gone. One is you can start killing and eating animals, and the other is you can start eating more plant matter, more vegetation, more roots, more stems, stuff like that. And that's the pathway the other great apes seem to have taken. So the gorilla's gone for the plants, and the other great apes have gone for more insects and meat in order to survive the loss of the fruit supply. Humans, though, somehow we've managed to outwit everything else, and our adaptation is the big brain, or it's actually not big. There's a whole story to that, and I've done an article about that too. But we've become more intelligent, and of course we're doing the similar things to the other chimpanzees, but we've evolved technology, so we can cook, we can process, we can travel, and we can do agriculture as well. We figured out how we can grow different varieties of things to be hardier. So we figured out all these other results or coping strategies for the shortage of the fruit.
Excellent. Yeah. And I guess what is you mentioned the brain there, because I mean I'm under the impression that humans had a bigger brain or a more evolved brain than the other apes or other animals. So what's the truth there, and why would our brain have developed like that?
Well, yeah, this is a strange thing. There's actually a book about this, um, which I think I do reference in my material somewhere. But basically, our brains grow at exactly the same rate as, say, the brain of a pig. So we're not unusual in our, if you like, our brain development process. Um, there's nothing. It doesn't require a special amount of nutrients or anything like that. The way our brains are bigger in proportion to everything else is actually because the rest of our body is kind of scrawny and weak. So our arms and our torso is kind of pathetic, basically. It's like the brain is just growing normally on the normal trajectory, but our body, and particularly when we're born, our legs are kind of scrawny.
Mm,
So our legs, if you were to plot like a chart with like head, body, legs on it, it would be different to the other kind of mammals. So, and it's not just the bit, the head grows faster kind of thing. The head grows the same.
yeah.
It's the body and the legs are doing funny things. They're not normal.
Right.
Most other mammals have a much bigger body on them, or they might have bigger legs, or they might have we have big kind of have big legs and scrawny arms and a scrawny torso. And there's actually a name for it. It's called the Chihuahua fallacy, which is quite interesting, and
Okay.
that's in this book. And so when you understand that, there's actually not too much that's exceptional about our brain size. It just happens that it grows for longer, so it takes longer to fully grow. So that's how it gets bigger. I mean, what I'm saying is the how it gets bigger is
Yeah.
important to understand. The details are important.
And why? What? So would you be in the camp of thinking that the reason that humans um, have evolved in a different way to other apes is to do with cooking food, to do with fruit, to do with meat, or a combination of these things, or we're not that exceptional, or what's your way of looking at that?
Yeah, I think it's to do it's all rooted in bipedalism. So at some point in our natural history, we started to become fruit pickers. And I mean, I don't know the details, not something I looked into hugely, so I'm kind of making this up a bit on the moment, but it's my thoughts on it. Um, Picking fruit's quite efficient, so we were our niche probably we weren't so much the tree climbers, so our ancestors were more sort of like browsers, so they wandered around plucking fruit and picking it with their upper body. Now that means because we don't have to climb trees, we're not naturally built like Arnie. Yes, all of that bodybuilder craziness. It's all by drugs. It's a
Yeah,
drug trip. We're not supposed to have big, strong upper bodies. Our evolution is weak torso, weak arms. It's an efficiency to save energy.
yeah,
So consequently, we save energy by having this weak body and arms. And we put the big bit is our legs. So we're good at running and so forth, or not particularly bad at it. So we've got that efficiency, and it's just a niche that we had, because niches are great because then you stop competing with other things. So while the other primates are all climbing up in trees and howling at each other because they all want to get to the fruit and the leaves and the trees, we humans were out there plucking our fruits. And I guess there were other kinds of hominids around, maybe that were similar to us. There might not have been. We might have been a unique line of evolution, but likely there were other hominoids of a similar nature to us, and either we killed and ate them, or we outcompeted them, or whatever. In the ancient, dusts of time,
yeah,
we survived and came forwards. But the other thing that comes with that bipedalism is we've got these hands, and they with the thumbs on them for plucking the fruits, and they're kind of useful. Not only can you pluck fruits with them, you can do other things, like you could make spears, you could make implements to dig the ground. So we naturally got this ability to make tools a little bit more easily than other creatures, because we're fruit pickers, we're fruit specialists. We've got the hands for picking the fruit. It's a specialization.
Another thing that I remember you actually talking about and giving some presentations on at Connor's event and maybe at the UK festival as well. I think you were interested, I don't know if this is something you're interested in at the moment, but in like polyamorous kind of lifestyle and maybe maybe alternative relationships, or I'm not sure what you would label it. And
Yeah.
how does that all fit in with everything, and what's your thoughts on that now, and what even is that, I suppose?
Well, yeah, there's two sides to this. So when I was with Sophie, we were much along the polyamory line. We'd read the same book about polyamory, or about trying to make it scientific. I can't remember the name of it, but I think it's called something like Love at Dawn, something like that. It's quite well known.
Sex at Dawn.
Sorry? Sex at Dawn. That could be it. Yeah. And I read that, and I was quite influenced by that. It seemed to make sense, and kind of purely from a logical perspective, if you just think about it as a philosopher, I'm completely on board with polyamory. I don't see why should we limit our love and sex life to one person. It doesn't really make any sense if you look at it philosophically. And I have no problems, still to this day, no problems with people being polyamorous. If that's for them and it works, that's fine. But eventually somebody published a very detailed rebuttal to, what was it, Sex at Dawn, called Sex at Dusk, and it completely pulls it to pieces. And the reality is that essentially, biologically, we are not really geared up for polyamory. It's more along the lines that we're geared up in a somewhat horrible way. I'll say nature is horrible, but we want to be monogamous, but have a bit on the side. That's right. It's two strategies. So one strategy that's very successful is to be pair bonded to one person for long enough to produce a child, and that very successfully produces a child that can then go on to have more children. Right.
Yeah.
So that's like that's plan A. That's strategy A of our biology. Meet somebody, stay with them, and knock out probably just one or two children with them. Now, at the same time, from again purely biologically, it makes complete sense. If somebody else makes themselves available, well, hey, why not have a bit of fun with them and knock off a few more children on the periphery, but maybe you don't look after them. So that's the sort of where the natural histories come from. It's have your cake and eat it, as it were, in the evolutionary sense, and that completely makes sense. But of course, it leads to this tension where you naturally don't want your partner being with somebody else. So we have this thing called jealousy, which of course is completely adaptive. It's a biological programming to stop your partner from making babies with somebody else. So we have all this circuitry, which I think is perfectly natural and healthy and adaptive, which basically primes us to be monogamous, but not religiously perfectly monogamous. We still have plan B is still in our minds. And there's difference between the sexes as well. For men, like they say, men are more like dogs, women are more like cats. So our psychologies are fundamentally wired up differently based on these biological game plans for reproduction. But polyamory, in theory, is you make all of this conscious, and you work with it consciously.
Yeah, so I know someone that is a counselor for many years, and he sort of practices or preaches polyamory, and he sort of says that when he would counsel people, that many of them, if he was to say to them, "Did you ever cheat on your partner in their marriage?" and he said that many people had, and I don't know if that's always the case, but many people had, and he was saying, well, it was basically it's just that, but being honest about it, right? Um,
Hmm.
but I know that I guess that you might have been a bit of an influence on Connor, and him and Brittany did a lot with videos on polyamory and stuff like that, and maybe still do. I'm not sure. Um,
Yeah, I think they're still doing that. Yeah, I haven't checked into them super recently,
yeah,
but yeah, I think that's still part of their lifestyle and they promote that.
and I've seen that around the raw food scene. It's sometimes been a part of
Hmm.
fruit festivals and things like that. Not a huge, not like the main part, but like a fringe part of it. And it's not really been attractive to me as a concept. But I always do question, like, if I was in the position where I just had this abundance of beautiful women always throwing themselves at me, like maybe it would be hard. Maybe you would be all of a sudden you'd be like, yeah, this is a great idea, And I don't know if it's something that for certain people in certain situations is maybe works for them, and then for other people, sometimes their partner might not be so happy about it or whatever. I don't know, but what's been your experience with all that? Have you um is it basically the jealousy, I suppose, is the difficult thing to deal with?
Right. So what I would say is there's two kinds of jealousy. There's a natural, adaptive kind of jealousy, which is our nature. We don't really want our partners to be with somebody else. Now you can challenge whether that's natural, because of course there's people out there will say, no, no, I'm really happy when my girlfriend goes and sees somebody else. Now I don't know about whether I necessarily believe that. It's not been my experience. But maybe there are people like that, and I've met people that will say and talk about that. And I think you have to at least accept that there might be that kind of person out there genuinely, that has no problem. I think they're the exception,
Yeah.
and they might be a bit unusual. Um, yeah, I think they probably are. So I don't think those exceptions really change the rule book. But I don't want to get into talking about what's
Sure.
normal and stuff like that, because that gets into some subjective value judgments. And again, our biology is not 100%. We're not just the genes that make us. Our upbringing, our experience, the way we develop in the womb, blah blah blah. These are
Yeah.
all going to make us different, and create people. That's one of the great things about us humans is we're not all the same. We're huge. There's a huge variety of different people out there. So there's nothing that you can really put into a box and say, well, this is a natural human. This is the natural human way. It's not. Clearly it's much more complex than that. Um, so
What do you think
sorry.
about what do you think about generally the state of kind of modern dating relationships between men and women, particularly in the West, I suppose, where you have a situation where uh, all of a sudden, or maybe for the first time in history, for example, there's a number of different factors that are different now, which is at least for the time that we've been alive, yourself, myself, people of my generation, you're maybe slightly older than me, people older than you even, never went to war. Life wasn't particularly hard. You survived
Yeah.
childhood quite easily. Um, and economically, like the machines and everything came around, so physical brute strength hasn't been as important a thing anymore in terms of being a part of the workplace and economics and all that. So we've got a different system, and women can be part of that system more easily, and more jobs available for them. And all these things have kind of shifted, and then medical advances and birth control, and
Mm.
and then religions kind of faded a little bit in terms of its influence on how people interact, and it's led to a more free, open way of relating, and
Yeah.
people can make their own choices, and people are sort of delaying marriage or commitment more, and even the statistics that there's a lot of men who aren't establishing relationships or struggling with that and aren't having sex later on, and all these things. And
Incels, yeah.
people are more promiscuous probably, or some people are, and women are
Yeah.
more promiscuous, and less women have had children now. This is in the West, of course. Um, so there's all these things going on. I don't know if it's necessarily leading to people having more, necessarily more happiness or whatever. I don't know exactly, or better relationships necessarily. But do you have any opinion on all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, I guess we're kind of champions of our own success and victims of it as well. I mean, I would, if I had to label myself politically, it would be something like libertarian or anarchist or something like this. So, I think people belong to themselves and should be able to live the life that they want to live, as long as they don't harm others. So,
Sure.
that's my sort of philosophical principle around ethics and living. But at the same time, with responsibility, with liberty and freedom of choice, comes the responsibility for what the outcomes are going to be. And I think it's easy to be naive about what our choices are and forget the biology. The biology is actually very important, and has consequences. So, for example, I've had some of my children probably a bit, or most of them, older than I should have done, and likewise for my girlfriends. It's optimal to have children when you're in your 20s. When you start to get into your 30s, then the chance of you producing a genetically damaged offspring, it starts to go up and up and up. And you can ask the question: is it really ethical to take that risk with your life and with the life of another person? Shouldn't you be ethically? Shouldn't you try and have the children in your 20s or whatever, when it's optimal for the health of the child?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting question. But I mean, there's all sorts of trade-offs you could get into when you start to dig into these things. Children of older parents, okay, they might be more likely to be autistic, but then they're also more likely to benefit from better income of the parents and blah blah blah. So the whole thing is really very complicated, and I don't know that you can try and distill out some sort of simple rules around it. But I think if you can try and bear nature in mind, and of course take into account what's going on in the present and how things are now, that's the best sort of general approach to it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it is concerning when you look at historically. Of course, you couldn't go on to whatever dating platform and find, 10 really sexy guys, the top 10 sexy guys, and go and date and have a relationship with them. Women didn't have that opportunity. It was the guy next door or the guy on the other side of the village, and that was pretty much it for most of our history. So on the one side, like we're mixing things up a bit more, which is probably a good thing. We're less inbred,
Right.
But it has downsides as well, because when men can't get women, when women can't get men, there's going to be some disappointment. There's unhappiness. For men, this can lead to alienation, social alienation. So men can be more violent when they can't get girlfriends, or they could be more depressed. So we can get this wave of depression. And then likewise for women, if they maybe if they don't get the long-term partner that they've wanted, then they can be a bit depressed. So there's a whole load of complications that come out of this great freedom and choice that we have today as well. But at the end of the day, I think we have to follow who we are as individuals, and I think it comes back to this kind of Buddhist thing of there's going to be suffering. There's going to be It's a part of life. We can't get rid of it. But if we can, we want to be conscious of the suffering that we might cause ourselves and try and avoid that. Be smart, as smart as you can.
Yeah.
But you know, just based on my understanding of the biology now, I'm kind of more into promoting monogamous relationships. Okay, if you can do some polyamory, that's fine. But if you're going to have children, then you've probably got to do much more careful calculations how you do that to actually make it work and give the children the best opportunity. So you've got to take all of these different inputs into account.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of go into the some of your arguments, I guess, for are humans omnivores or we are herbivores? What are the main what's the way that you look at that, and how do you present that argument to someone?
Right, so there's some steps which I outlined in the video. So we start with this idea, like if you think this is from Kant, so you have an analytical proposition is something like this: animals that consume animal and plant matter are omnivores. So that's purely like a text descriptive thing of we give this label to this.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the synthetic proposition, which is humans are omnivores because humans consume animal and plant matter. So that synthetic proposition has like a real world observation tied to it. So we can check it and prove it by looking at the real world. So when we say humans are omnivores, that's one of these synthetic propositions. And we could accept, so the next step is to, if we accept that humans are omnivores because we do eat plant and animal matter, well, then the problem with that is it's a naive definition, as I point out in my video. So like cats will consume grass, for example, and goats will consume insects because when they're eating grass, there's insects on the grass. And you could even take it to an even more absurd degree, like pollen is flying around in the air everywhere. So every carnivore, when it eats, is eating some pollen. And similarly, there's microscopic insects in the air, on the ground, everywhere, contaminating all our food. So if we take that naive definition of omnivore, then everything's an omnivore. So of course that's completely meaningless. And that just begs the next question, well, what kind of omnivores are we? Are we the mostly herbivorous kind of omnivore, or the mostly carnivorous, or the mostly fruit-eating one? So that naive definition doesn't really help us at all. So we have to get into the next step in the thinking, which is having some quantitative criteria. So, okay, a little bit of animal matter doesn't change you from being a herbivore to being an omnivore, and a little bit of vegetation doesn't change you from being a carnivore into an omnivore. So we have to have some like separation of the categories. They're still fuzzy, they still overlap, but we've got to have some kind of criteria to separate. So the next step in the thinking after that was what I already explained to you. We look at the primates and we see that they eat one of three different kinds of diet. It's fruit, or it's animals, or it's vegetation, and it will be one of the two of them. So then it becomes, what are we? Are we fruit and vegetation plus minimal animal, or we fruit and animal plus minimal vegetation, etc.? Then we develop the idea to the next step, which is we recognize that animals adjust their behavior in order to survive in the short term. So for example, there used to be a bear in London Zoo, and people used to throw a lot of candy into its cage, or confection. And the bear would eat this stuff because it's food, it's edible, it's food, it nourishes it. But eventually, of course, the bear gets catastrophically ill from eating candy or confection, and the zoo has to put the animal down.
Wow.
And of course, now you see signs in the zoo which say, don't feed the animals.
Right.
So that's the next bit of the equation, realizing that animals and what they eat are not necessarily adaptive to their biological makeup. So that brings us to the final step in the thinking. Right, we know all of the preceding information. what we need to do is to figure out what we're adapted to. And that has a particular kind of science that it's about, called comparative biology. So then we can look for the different biological traits that distinguish the different animals: carnivore, omnivore, herbivore, roughly speaking, and of course frugivore, which is a particular kind of specialist herbivore. And once we've got that figured out, then we can go away and look at the literature, and we can find comparative biology for the different kind of animals that feed different ways, and then we can find, well, which categories do we tick the box in. And that's this is completely what my research video is about on YouTube, and that's also called our Humans Omnivores. And in that I go through the steps which I've just mentioned, of working out the thinking first of how we should solve this problem, and then I actually go through the various bits and pieces of science where you've got herbivore, omnivore, carnivore data available, and I say, well, what's true for humans?
Excellent.
And then when you do that process, you find consistently that we don't fit into the omnivore category.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's, where can people find out more about this, and if they want to follow you, if you've got any, where should they go to get that information and so on?
Right, so all of the scientific stuff and the link to the video are on the weareherbivores.com website. So, and I've also got citations of all the scientific information that I use in the research video, much of which I also mentioned in the book before, and I think there's a link to that as well. So that's all there. And, you know, I continue to follow the scientific literature and add things to the website, you know, as I go. But pretty much at the moment, I would say that the theory is very robust. But as I point out, these categories are fuzzy, and you know, we're not talking, when we say herbivore, that means plant-based. It doesn't mean vegan, for example. So there is a difference, and that's important to point out, because we get into this whole thing of vitamin B12 and stuff like that, that always complicates an otherwise quite simple message.
Excellent, John. So before we finish off today, is there anything else you want to share with us?
Well, yeah, I'll just say, you know, the idea of the project next is to develop a documentary to make this bigger and make this more consumable, because, you know, people don't really want to watch science videos at the end of the day. The number of people that will watch those kind of things is vanishingly small, because it's dry and not fun. So I'd like to make the documentary. So if anyone wants to help me on that or contribute to that, financially or skill-wise, it wouldn't be a big thing to do, I don't think. But, you know, I'm told by other documentary makers that it is. So, you know, that's what I'd like to finish with, a request. And yeah, if anyone wants to contribute and make this happen, that would be great, because we want to popularize the idea and challenge this myth. And you know, people will justify their dietary choices through the most irrational and shallow of sort of apologistic reasons. And if we can keep pushing against that, you know, the vegan thing has the ethical argument. Well, let's also give the scientifically robust argument as well, so that there's no corners left uncovered, basically.
Excellent, John. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, and I encourage everyone to go and check out John's information. And for all of you watching and listening, thank you for that, and feel free to share this with other people that might find this interesting. Feel free to comment below, rate the video, give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and so on. And if you want to learn more about this lifestyle, you can go to fruitfest.co.uk. The UK Fruit Fest is still happening each year and will happen in July 2023 from the 21st to the 28th of July. And you're very welcome to check that information out and see if that might be for you. We also have an online group on Friday nights where we have speakers and discussion on raw food, raw vegan related topics. And you'll find all that information if you join the newsletter. Go to the website fruitfest.co.uk or go to the link below this video and you should be able to find more information about that. Thank you very much for watching and listening, everyone. And John, I'll speak to you again another time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you all in the next episode of the Love Fruit podcast. Thank you very much, everyone.